Hi there, Chandra Easton here from Star Astrology Healing, Living in Light. I'm continuing on with the series of talks that I've been giving on 2020, the year of decision. And I'm using esoteric astrology and a bit of mundane astrology to help us remember or learn what are the various spiritual tests that are associated with the different signs of the zodiac. And so this teaching today is on the sign of Cancer, which governs the period 21st of June to the 20th of July. Alright, so the sign of Cancer governs humanity as a whole, governs the human kingdom. It's one of the only signs that governs the human kingdom. Well, I suppose that and Aquarius. Aquarius governs the human kingdom in a more enlightened form, and the sign of Cancer governs the spiritual birthing of the human kingdom. With each of the signs of the zodiac, there are a couple of keynotes, and the keynote for the personal self or for the ego, that refers to how we use Cancer coming from the ego's perspective, is let revelation be the rule and yet the crowd exists. This is something to contemplate. Interesting because it has the possibility or the hopes and the dreams of the revelations as the spiritual awakening that is the promise of the sign of Cancer, but it also has that tendency to fall back to the lowest common denominator, the crowd. This is what happens, and this is the way we use Cancer. If we're an ordinary person and we're not looking for the spiritual path, we're not seeking to better ourselves, we're very content with ourselves and the world the way it is, and we've simply handed over our personal responsibility to others to make the decisions for us. However, for those who are approaching the spiritual path, getting closer to the spiritual path, maybe have standing at the door, the entrance to the spiritual path, or have some spiritual experience behind them, either from past lives or in this current life, then the keynote for Cancer is, I build a lighted temple and therein dwell. Yeah, so this is the same thread or the same teaching to do with revelation, and the instruction here with the keynote is to build a lighted temple. This is within the body, a temple for the soul, to dedicate the body as the vehicle for the soul of spirit, and then dwell within that light. So that's the way forward. Now, traditionally, Cancer, which is one of the cardinal signs, one of the motivating active signs, dynamic signs, is governed by the moon. And what the moon does is it, well, we know that it affects tides, it also affects our emotions, it affects us through mass consciousness. Mass consciousness comes to us in a variety of ways these days, through the internet, through so many forms of media, television, radio, all the various ways that we are impacted by mass consciousness. So the moon governs Cancer in its lowest vibration for ordinary humanity. And when the moon is governing, then the form life, that's the physical body, all the physical and the astral bodies, they dominate, and we're content with that. Yeah? Governs the group, governs the crowd. Interesting, in the middle of this time of pandemic, when there's been quite a lot of talk about the herd immunity, the moon governs herd immunity. But it's the personal self. Now, as we progress a little bit, or strive to progress towards greater self-insight, being better people, treating others the way we would like to be treated, then eventually the moon gives way with its rulership. And the moon is said to veil Vulcan for those who are aspiring to the spiritual path, or Vulcan. It veils Uranus for those who have arrived upon or are working to build greater soul light upon the spiritual path. And it also is veiled by the planet Neptune in its highest octave, that would take us away from the masses and deeper within the heart of consciousness and the heart of light. Yeah, so the moon is of all the planets in esoteric astrology, the moon is the one that most strongly takes us back to safety, takes us back to the ego, takes us back to the old territory, to the herd, to the crowd. It's a point where we can all, if we're not careful, regress. Yeah. And then the soul is the aspect of ourselves that is seeking to move in the opposite direction, towards awakening, towards healing, towards beyond the individual to the group. Yeah? So it's got a great deal to do with regression, has a great deal to do with the ego and places of safety, but equally it has a great amount to do with birth and the birthing of higher consciousness. We know in a physical birth that it's not just the woman, the pregnant mother, and her body that are involved in birth, that the child in the womb is as active, if not more active, in the process of birthing. And the same can be said for the soul. So what's happening at the moment in this year of the Great Decision and the years that will follow it is that our humanity's collective soul is actively striving to birth into greater consciousness and greater light. And just as at a physical birth there will be the baby in the womb waiting to be born, there's the mother and there are the midwives. So in the spiritual realm there's the awaiting soul, there's the mother in us, the part of us that is striving to be the best that we can be, and then there are the holy ones, the holy mothers, who are there to assist us in this process. Yes. Now the sign of Cancer is very interesting because it stands at, it is known as one of the great gates of the sun. And this is because it's connected to the solstices. So, and this is on the 21st of June and the 21st of December. So here in the southern hemisphere, we're approaching the winter solstice at the moment, whilst in the northern hemisphere they're approaching the summer solstice. Yes, very interesting. I don't know what the different experiences would be if you lived your life in one hemisphere or another. An area of research, no doubt. But for our purposes, when we are moving through June, irrespective of what season we're in, when we cross the threshold of the 21st of June, then we cross the threshold of the Great Gate of Cancer. Yeah? The Great Gate of Cancer. And this is the gate that takes us into incarnation and takes us into form life. And it's a first step of emerging consciousness and emerging awakening. And sometimes called, I think by the Egyptians, it was called the gateway of the souls. And as I mentioned, humanity are pregnant at the moment. We are pregnant with soul consciousness. Our kingdom, the entire human kingdom, is seeking to give birth to greater consciousness, to enter not only through the human experience, but to move above the physical, the emotional, the mental, towards the realms of soul and spirit. The other great gate of the sun, 6 months away, on the 21st of December, is the gate of Capricorn. And when I say gate, I'm talking about 0 degrees. The zodiac is made up of 360 degrees, divided into 12 signs, each sign having 30 degrees. So 0 degrees Cancer is the very beginning of the 4th sign of the zodiac. That's the first great gate. And it stands directly opposite the 10th great gate, that is the gate of Capricorn, at 0 degrees into the 10th sign of the zodiac. Now the opposite is true for Capricorn. Capricorn is the door or the gate to the higher way, the higher path of unity with the soul, the higher path of initiation, the higher path of connecting and entering into a conscious relationship with the Holy Ones. It's the gate that takes us into the group connection, into the heart, into the universal connection, sometimes known as the gate of the gods. So there we have the two gates, the gate of the souls entering into birth and the gate of the gods. It's a very, very interesting period, 2020, and exactly on the winter solstice here in the southern hemisphere on the 21st of June, we have a solar eclipse, a very momentous solar eclipse. And I won't speak about it here. I'll just direct you to the teaching on that called, what's it called? Call from the Mountains, yes. And the reason I've called it that is because the solar eclipse occurs in the mountainous region between India and Nepal and Tibet and China. So I'll leave you to look that up and enter into that teaching, which will help you understand not only 2020 but the next couple of years as well. So going back to the sign of Cancer, if you look at the glyph of the sign of Cancer, you could imagine it's many things. It looks a bit shell-like. It looks a bit like the embryo in the womb. It looks like a person sleeping. It's two interlocking figures. And what's meant to happen is that we move around and around and around and through the various signs of the zodiac, incarnating in sign after sign after sign, hopefully developing more awareness and eventually soul consciousness and soul awareness. And slowly but surely the movement through the signs of the zodiacs, whenever we get to the sign of Cancer, we have an opportunity to turn the circle into a spiral. Yes. And if we manage here in this early part of the 21st century to turn the circle of evolution into an upward spiral, then we'll harness the energies of ascension, and we'll harness the energies of Lady Isis, and we will grow in soul stature as a kingdom. This is also a very interesting subject, and again I refer you to a talk on this matter, and the talk on my website or my YouTube channel is called Children of the New Civilization. It's an hour-and-a-half talk that explains this momentous changing of the guard between the age of Pisces and the age of Aquarius. All right, okay, now the constellation Argo is a constellation that is in the region of the sign of Cancer in the heavens. However, constellation Argo is an enormous constellation, and it spans how many? Cancer, Leo, Virgo, Libra, Scorpio, Sagittarius, Capricorn, 7 signs of the zodiac. And the ancients referred to it as Argo the ship. Yes. And esoterically, what we understand from this is that the experiences that our souls are trying to teach us as we enter into the Cancerian incarnation. So this could be if you have your sun in Cancer, or you have your moon in Cancer, or you have your rising sign in Cancer, or you have your ruling planet in Cancer, is that it's probably going to take us several incarnations until we arrive at the sign of Capricorn somewhere down the track. And the movement from the sign of Cancer to the sign of Capricorn is a movement out of the herd, out of the masses, through intuition, and into soul light, and into deeper and deeper connection to the group heart and the universal heart. Yeah, some of the old images for the constellation Argo show that there's a prow with the ram's head, the ram's horn, sitting at the front of the ship, and then at the back of the ship, right at the end, we have the fish's tail. So the ancients realised that Argo had a great connection to this movement through the entire zodiac of the human kingdom. Now, the strongest, the brightest star in the constellation Argo is Canopus. Now, I was going to look that up, and do you think I can remember where it is? Somewhere in Cancer. And Canopus is very interesting because the Egyptians had a great reverence for the fixed stars we're talking about here around the sign of Cancer. And this is because it was connected to the fixed star of Sirius, and I'm pretty sure Canopus also were known as the heliacal, I'm not sure if that's how you pronounce it, stars, and they rose above the Nile to let everybody know that the flood was coming. And of course the flood brought life to Egypt. It's a country and a nation who live in the middle and surrounded by desert. And without the flood there was no life. And for this reason, Canopus and Sirius are highly revered in the ancient Egyptian tradition. And Canopus in particular is associated with the mother god. And in more of the European mythology, this is connected, she's connected to Bridget in the Celtic mythology. Now the Egyptians have what are known as canoptic jars, and when they embalmed their pharaohs, because they had a great spirituality associated with the safeguarding of the passage of the soul from the physical body after a person had died through the underworld to the realms of soul and spirit. And in order to ensure this safeguarding, the process of mummification and the sarcophagus and the canoptic jars were all part and parcel of the rituals and the traditions. And the canoptic jar was where the heart was placed, and then placed inside the sarcophagus of the royal family members or the pharaoh. And they were protected and looked over by Anubis, the god of the underworld, to ensure safe passage. And so here we are at the moment with the end or the death of the age of Pisces, and we're seeking safe passage to awaken the Christ child within us, irrespective of one's religion. When I say the Christ child, I mean the heart of goodness, the heart of love. So our goal for humanity is to move through this journey, just as the pharaohs did, from death to life, from the physical world through the underworld to the realms of immortality. Yes, and therefore the transition through the period of Cancer, it requires great protection. Otherwise, because what's happening is that we're going through the apparent darkness. And Cancer is interesting, is that the zodiacal, the constellation of Cancer simply does not have bright stars like many of the other constellations. And this movement from instinct, which represents the herd or the body, through intellect, which represents the mind or the ego, towards intuition, which represents the soul, this is the task and the tests associated with the sign of Cancer. Yes, and the search for intuition is a very elusive search because one needs to harness and develop sensitivity and deep occult insights and wisdom. Otherwise we will miss the signs, we will miss the quiet voice of our soul. And once we can access and connect in to our intuition, then we have our inner guide, so that we know that we can safely arrive in the realms of spirit. There are a number of symbols associated with the sign of Cancer. The most commonly known one is that of the crab. And the crab's an interesting creature because it lives upon the earth, the physical realms, but it also lives quite happily in the water. And one of the tests, and some of the major tests of the sign of Cancer, is about moving from clear water to pure water. You could say moving through the astral or the psychic realms, the lower astral or the psychic realms, to the higher realms, the higher astral, wherein the soul can begin to descend and cast intuition towards us. From the Egyptian tradition, the scarab beetle is very strongly connected to the sign of Cancer, and I know that the scarab is known as Kephara in the Egyptian, is connected to life and connected to resurrection and connected to hope. Yes, so this theme of rebirth and reincarnation and resurrection and hope is there with the scarab. And just drawing upon that theme of I build a lighted temple and therein dwell. From the esoteric perspective, the purpose of life on earth is to purify our personality, to lift above our physical bodies and the desires of those, to harness and access and purify the mind, and to reach to the realms of soul and spirit, and therefore develop intuition. And as we do that, then our soul can begin to inhabit our body, and this is the I build a lighted temple and therein dwell. I think there's a lot of biblical, there are certainly some biblical connections to the sign of Cancer, and one of them is Lord Jesus speaking about himself as a shepherd, guiding his flock of sheep. Now, esoterically, sheep are associated with Aries, one of the signs of spiritual aspirancy, whereas goats, on the other hand, are associated with the sign of Capricorn, spiritual maturity. Now, of course, this does not mean that if you're a Cancerian that you're stuck in the herd, or you're caught in the ego, or you're not evolved or not spiritual. It's far more complex than that. You can't apply it just to the sun sign. And similarly, it does not mean if your sun's in Capricorn that you're therefore spiritually evolved and you're a goat. No. It's far more complex than that. And this is the realm of esoteric astrology, as distinct from exoteric astrology. A vast subject. I'll leave that and continue on. I'm still talking about the constellation of Cancer. The strongest configuration in the constellation of Cancer is a fixed star known as the manger, also called the beehive, also known as Prosape, sometimes also known as the cradle of life. So some of these, and this is very bright, well, it's not very bright actually, because none of the stars in Cancer are bright. It's located in the head of the nebula, and it's associated with floods. So there's that theme of the flood again. The flood is very strongly connected to Sirius and ancient Egypt, and it's also connected to the fixed star known as the manger in the constellation of Cancer. I find it interesting the other words of the cradle, because the cradle has that baby and that birthing and that mother energy. And the beehive, well, the beehive, I suppose, to me is my association with this is of great industry and sweetness. There are other links to what they refer to as the ass's tail, two tails, the ass's tail and the ass's head, that are very strongly connected into the biblical mythology, but I won't go into those. I'm just reinforcing the theme here that the sign of Cancer is associated with this birthing, this awakening, this entering into the cradle of human experience and knowing oneself to be part of a group beyond the mind, beyond the body, beyond the desires, beyond duality, and striving to lift oneself to the realms of spirit. Yes, now the fixed star Sirius that is there in the 15th degree of Cancer is known as the star of eternal hope, often called the dog star, very, very bright, visible star from the northern hemisphere. Yes. And interestingly, here at the moment, and every year on the 7th of July, within a couple of days either side of the 7th of July, our sun transits across the fixed star Sirius. So there's a Sun-Sirius conjunction, at the end of that first week of July. And I'm brought to mind here of, am I right in thinking that it's the Independence Day is the 4th of July? Yes, and I know in the Maitreya Theosophy tradition we work with and we celebrate and revere Lady Isis and also the Lord Master Ra on the 4th of July. So a significant time and a time for humanity to find hope. Here in 2020, Mercury, throughout the month of June, is very close to Sirius. And so this asks us to tune in and to find light, to find faith, to find hope, and to keep it safe as a light within our hearts. Okay, what I might do now is move to explore the myth of Hercules. And I've been talking about the myths of Hercules in this series of talks. And Hercules is, from the ancient tradition, the spiritual aspirant who's been given 12 tasks. And each task helps him grow in spiritual stature. And you could say that we are all facing the various tasks associated with the different signs of the zodiac because of the momentous times that we're living in as we enter more deeply into the great change. So the myth or the labour or the task that Hercules has in the sign of Cancer is the capture of the doe of Hind. Okay, now the presiding one, think of the presiding one as the teacher who gives Hercules the instructions, what the task's about, provides a test which evokes a wise choice. And the presiding one sends him to labour in a field where he must decide which voice of all the many voices will arouse the obedience of his heart. Okay, so a bit along the same theme as the Gemini labour where there was intuition, but instead where there was the need for discrimination, but here it's the developing of intuition. So the test is one of apparent great simplicity. The presiding one points out to Hercules that there's a doe, a young deer with golden horns, known as the golden hind, grazing in a field on a far hill. And Hercules is instructed that he needs to capture this golden deer, the hind. Seems like a simple enough test. And the test is geared towards assisting in the awakening of the inner life. And inherent in the test is the need to learn to choose and to decide which part of one's identity one follows. Do we follow our instinct? That's the body. Do we follow our intellect? That's the mind. Or do we listen and try and find the intuition? That's the voice of the soul. Remembering that in the previous 4 signs, the test in Aries was Hercules had a test all to do with his mind. And the test in Taurus was to do with desire. The test in Gemini was to do with resolving duality within him. And the test within him or her. And the test within Cancer is about moving out of the mass consciousness, out of the herd, out of the crowd, and towards the group, and finding inner wisdom, intuition. Yes, so there are 3 distinct stages, and therefore you would say that humanity, or those members of humanity who are striving to grow, to be better people, to create a better world, are moving through one or other of these 3 stages. The stage of moving beyond instinct, the stage of moving beyond intellect, or the stage of developing or recognising intuition. Okay, so in this myth, the doe, who's been pointed out, the beautiful deer with the golden horns, she represents the intuition, the still quiet voice within. And the word hind means to seize. Yes, so to seize gives you the idea that it's not going to be all that easy. You're going to have to be quick. And it's going to be difficult and elusive to grasp intuition. Now, the doe is also sacred to the Greek goddess of the moon, known as Artemis. Yes. And through the course of this labour, as Hercules sets out to find the doe, then he's setting out to find the higher realms and the higher worlds, not the physical world, not the world of desire, not the world of the mind, not the world of the psychic or the astral, but the higher realms of light. And in so doing has to develop inner senses, heightened awareness, and open up to intuitions and inspirations that are internal, not external. Yes, It's got to move beyond those three worlds of matter. Now, initially he encounters Artemis, this goddess of the moon. And Artemis represents, and she's symbolic for the world of form, the world of instinct. She's symbolic for the herd, for the group, for the crowd. Eh? But he doesn't just encounter Artemis, he also encounters Diana. Now, Diana is known as the huntress. Yeah? And she is the sun's king. The sun king is Apollo in the Greek tradition, although the sun king has many names in many traditions. Maitreya in the Theosophical tradition. So Diana is the daughter of the sun king, and she represents the intellect. Yeah. And then the third being, because we have two goddesses so far, Artemis representing instinct or the physical world, Diana representing intellect or the mental world, and then we have Apollo, the sun king, representative of our soul, representative of the spiritual realms. And so these three are encountered at various stages during the myth, during the labour. So the hind appears on the far hill, and at the same time Artemis and Diana also appear, and they both argue with Hercules, and they say, well, he can't search for the hind because the hind belongs to them, and they both claim the hind, the deer with the golden horns, for their own. They say that this deer belongs to the physical world, or she belongs to the intellectual world, and they're quarrelling over who owns the hind. So Hercules decides to leave them to it. It's a pretty good advice, really. Leave the body to its machinations, leave the mind to its machinations, and head off in the direction of the hind who's on the grazing on the far hill. Now it takes 1 year, and Hercules hunts the golden hind everywhere, uphill, down dale, across plains, through deserts, through forests, a whole year. This requires great persistence. So if we're seeking for our soul to speak to us and intuition to reveal itself, it's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take a whole season, a whole year, maybe several incarnations. Yeah? Eventually he finds where the deer is grazing, had been grazing, and now he's gone deep into a forest, and he finds that the deer is sleeping by a lake, deep within the forest. So he takes down his bow and arrow and he shoots at the deer. And the deer is wounded in the foot and cannot run away. Okay. So Hercules then approaches the deer, picks it up, carries it over his shoulder, and is about to make off with it. Don't know where he's going to go with it, maybe take it home. But then he hears a voice, the spirit, the still, quiet voice. And the voice says to him that the doe does not belong to humankind. That is, that the doe belongs to the temple that he had previously seen in the far distance on that hill behind the doe. So he's instructed by the voice of spirit, that's the voice of his soul. Yeah, this is his intuition, to carry it to the temple. So he carries the doe who is wounded, gently holding the doe close to his heart. And when he gets to the temple, he enters into the temple and he places the doe at the altar in the centre of the temple. And who should be at the temple but Artemis and Diana and Apollo, the three guides, you might say, who'd been there previously. And they're still arguing. Artemis and Diana are still arguing that this is their hind, this is their golden deer, that they want to take it back for service. They want this intuition of the soul And they want to take it back in service to the physical world or to the body or in service to the mind. Yes, now this temple has a name. It's the Sacred Temple of Mycenae. I looked it up. It's an hour and a half west of Athens in the Peloponnese. Yes, and clearly very, very sacred place in ancient Greek mythology. A holy place. So just to recap, we're going to spend at least a year, maybe several incarnations, searching for our intuition. We're going to have to overlook the body that believes that the purpose of the search is to look after the body. We're going to have to overlook the mind that believes that the purpose of the search is to feed the mind. We're going to have to look everywhere, look high and low. When we find the intuition and capture it, then hopefully we will hear our own still small voice within that reminds us that the intuition is there to serve holiness, and that therefore we need to carry the intuition to the sacred temple. Remembering that the keynote for Cancer is I build a lighted temple and therein dwell. Okay, so there's a link between the temple on the far hill and our body, which is the temple. When we arrive at the sacred temple, as Hercules did, again the body and the mind will quarrel and argue for ownership and control of the intuition. Yeah? The ego doesn't give up easily. Yeah? If it can't stop us pursuing the light of our soul, the intuition, then it will try and claim it for itself. Okay, so here we are standing outside the sacred temple of Mycenae, and Apollo intervenes in the quarrel between Artemis and Diana. And he says point blank to Artemis, who represents the body and the herd and mass consciousness, well, that you're barred from the temple, you can't come in. Artemis has the wrong motivation, doesn't have enough purity, can't come in. To Diana, who represents the mind, one might say that represents the ego, is admitted and asked what can she see. So Diana enters into the temple, looks at the deer and pronounces that the deer's dead, the doe is dead. Fails to see the deeper esoteric wisdom. Yeah? So just by using the rational mind, we're going to get it wrong. The deer, in fact, looks dead, but is not dead. So then Apollo's quite happy because he thinks, right, well, clearly this is my doe, my deer. And Apollo then explains to Hercules that the doe does not belong to any member of the human kingdom, and it belongs to itself, to the realm of spirit. So at this point, Apollo feels that his task and his journey and his striving has kind of been for nothing. But then Apollo reminds him that his heart is welcome and in fact resides within the temple. And that even though he is a son of man, he is also a son of God. Hercules is part human and part divine, just as you are part human and part divine. So the teaching here for Hercules is that he finds himself. He finds his own holiness. He gives up the persistence of the body to gain control over spirit. He gives up the persistence of the mind to gain control over spirit. He gives up the persistence of the ego to possess soul or intuition for his own end. And he recognises and is welcomed into the temple, and is reminded that he is in truth an aspect of the Godhead, an aspect of the divine. The key to all of this is that when he carried the doe, he carried her against his heart. And by uniting the heart of intuition to the physical heart, we end up being united with the greater heart, with the realms of spirit. So Hercules then goes back empty-handed but wiser, and no doubt filled with more light, back to a discussion with his teacher, the presiding one. And the presiding one reminds him that the fawn, who represented intuition, and the carrying of the fawn to the holy place is a task that has to be performed over and over and over and over again. We don't just get it right by one act of intuition or one act of entering into the temple. We are invited into the temple. This is the cave within our hearts, the inner realms of holiness, and we are invited over and over and over and over again. And eventually we will become one with the temple within. We will become one with our soul. We will move and progress on the spiritual path, and eventually we will arrive at the opposite sign of Capricorn, which is the other great gate that takes us, the gate of the gods, that will take us upon the higher way. Okay, so just to sum up here, for Hercules there was no success in this labour or this test until his instinct was transmuted into intuition. There was no success until he found a way of correctly using his intellect and to allow it to be guided by the intuition. And then the intellect forms a right relationship with the intuition. The intuition's role is to interpret and extend the intellect. This is into the higher mind. And through this, realisations occur. And when this expansion of intuition and realisations have occurred, then instinct, this is the physical elementals in the physical body, are subordinated into right relationship. We need the body in right relationship with the soul. Yeah. The body is the temple and the soul is the light that we must build, and build the lighted temple and then dwell therein. So I hope this has given you some insight into the sign of Cancer. And of course here in the middle of 2020 we have Pluto in the sign of Capricorn and Jupiter in the sign of Capricorn, and both of these planets have a great deal to do with the collapse of all the structures that have been built upon the sands of the material world, and everything that has been built upon a false premise is in the process of collapsing. But of course that's another talk. Lots of discussion around that in the teaching Call from the Mountains, and also in the talk Planetary Landscape for 2020. That's all for now. This has been Chandra Easton. Lovely to connect again. And of course, even though what I've been working with here is esoteric astrology that's broad and mundane astrology that governs, humanity and the year that we're currently in, esoteric astrology can be used for a variety of things to understand your life purpose, your relationships. I work with mundane astrology to help you understand your finances, your career. I work with medical astrology to assist you in gaining insight and therapeutic guidance for the physical body and chronic health conditions. Okay, that's all for now. Bye.